Hi, I'm Genevieve. My family used to say I was the one who couldn't hold down a real job, the daughter who bounced between silly startup ideas while my father built his manufacturing empire. At his retirement gala, I sat in the back corner like always, invisible and irrelevant, until he grabbed the microphone and declared, "Failures don't get speeches at my party." The room laughed. I stayed silent. Then the company VP stepped forward and said, "Before we conclude tonight, I need to introduce the incoming CEO who'll be taking over operations next week, Ms. Genevieve Finch." They called me a failure, then watched their golden boy's legacy get handed to the daughter he'd dismissed for 30 years. But that moment didn't start with his cruel announcement. It started with every business idea he'd crushed, every achievement he'd ignored, and every door I'd quietly opened while he wasn't looking. So what happens when the failure has been building her empire in the shadows? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air in Portland carried that familiar scent of ambition mixed with old money as I approached the grand ballroom at the Whitmore Hotel. Through the massive glass doors, I could see the glittering crowd already gathered for my father's retirement celebration. Darius Corvell, after 42 years of building Corvell Manufacturing into a regional powerhouse, was finally stepping down. The company that started in a modest warehouse in southeast Portland now employed over 3,000 people across the Pacific Northwest. I stood outside for a moment, adjusting my simple black dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. That had always been my approach at family events: blend into the background, stay out of the spotlight that naturally gravitated toward my father and his achievements. The valet gave me a polite nod as I handed over my keys to my 5-year-old Honda Civic, a stark contrast to the parade of BMWs and Mercedes already filling the parking structure. Inside, the ballroom was transformed into a monument to my father's legacy. Blown-up photographs lined the walls, showing the evolution of Corvell Manufacturing, from those early black-and-white shots of Dad in coveralls standing next to his first industrial lathe, to recent color images of him cutting ribbons at the newest facility in Spokane. A slideshow played on multiple screens, chronicling 4 decades of growth, innovation, and what the business journals like to call visionary leadership. The guest list read like a who's who of Pacific Northwest industry leaders. I recognized the mayor of Portland, chatting with a group of city council members near the bar. 3 different state senators had shown up, along with the presidents of 2 major banks, the CEO of the Port of Portland, and what looked like half the membership of the exclusive Multnomah Athletic Club. These were people who moved markets, influenced policy, and made decisions that affected thousands of jobs. I found my assigned seat at table 12, toward the back of the room, squeezed between my cousin Theron Varick, who managed one of the smaller Corvell facilities, and his wife Leora Thandrell, who always smiled politely but never quite looked at me when we spoke. The centerpiece blocked most of my view of the head table where my father sat surrounded by company executives, local dignitaries, and my mother Camille Sterling, who looked radiant in her emerald green gown, every inch the successful CEO's wife. "Genevieve, how nice that you could make it," Leora said, her voice carrying that particular tone that made it sound like my presence was mildly surprising. "I wasn't sure if you'd be able to get away from your little projects." My little projects, that's what they'd always called them. The consulting work, the business ventures, the companies I'd helped launch and scale. To them, anything that didn't involve manufacturing physical products in a traditional corporate structure was somehow less serious, less real. I'd learned long ago not to correct them, or try to explain the complexity of what I actually did. It only led to polite nods and quick changes of subject. The room buzzed with conversations about market expansions, new government contracts, and speculation about who would take over the company's leadership. I heard fragments as people moved past our table, discussions about potential successors, merger possibilities, and what this transition meant for the industry. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about Corvell Manufacturing's future, everyone except the one person at table 12, who had been quietly studying the company's operations, market position, and growth potential for years. My father commanded attention effortlessly, even while seated. At 73, he still carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people's livelihoods. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his custom-tailored suit impeccable, and when he laughed at something the mayor whispered in his ear, the sound carried across the room like a blessing. This was his night, his celebration, his moment to bask in the recognition of a career that had transformed a small family business into a regional industrial force. The irony wasn't lost on me that I sat in the back, picking at my salmon, while surrounded by people discussing the future of a company I probably understood better than anyone in the room except my father himself. But understanding and being recognized for that understanding were two entirely different things. I'd spent my career learning that lesson over and over again, in boardrooms from Seattle to San Francisco, where my ideas were often attributed to male colleagues, or where my presence was explained away as diversity hiring rather than merit-based selection. A waiter refilled my water glass, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the black tablecloth. 35 years old, MBA from Wharton, 15 years of experience in strategic consulting and corporate development, and yet here I sat at the family outcast table, introduced to business associates as Darius's daughter, who's involved in some kind of consulting work. The dismissal had become so routine that I'd stopped trying to correct it years ago. The evening's program lay beside my plate, an elegant bound booklet outlining the night's speakers. My father would deliver the keynote address, of course. The mayor would present him with a key to the city. The president of the Oregon Manufacturers Association would give remarks about his contributions to the industry. 3 different executives from partner companies were scheduled to share stories about working with Corvell Manufacturing. But my name appeared nowhere on the program, not even in the acknowledgments section that thanked family members for their support. As the salad course arrived, I watched my mother lean over to whisper something to my father. He glanced in my direction briefly, his expression unreadable, then turned back to his conversation with the bank president sitting to his left. Whatever Mom had said, it hadn't sparked any gesture of acknowledgement in my direction. That was fine, I hadn't expected one. Expectations had a way of leading to disappointment, and I'd learned to manage mine carefully over the years. The irony was that I'd driven here directly from a meeting that would have impressed everyone in this room, if they'd known about it. But they didn't know, because I'd stopped sharing professional updates with family years ago, tired of watching their eyes glaze over, or hearing my achievements minimized as networking or lucky breaks. It was easier to let them maintain their assumptions, than to constantly defend my credibility and competence. The memory hit me as I watched my father accept congratulations from yet another group of admirers. I was 23, fresh out of business school, and I'd spent 3 months developing a comprehensive analysis of Corvell Manufacturing's expansion opportunities in the Southwest market. I'd identified specific acquisition targets, calculated market penetration strategies, and prepared detailed financial projections, showing how the company could triple its revenue within 5 years. I'd presented my findings over Sunday dinner at my parents' house in the hills overlooking Lake Oswego. My father had listened politely while cutting his roast beef, occasionally nodding but never asking questions. When I finished my presentation, complete with charts and market analysis that had taken me months to compile, he'd set down his fork and looked at me with that mixture of patience and condescension I'd come to know so well. "That's very ambitious, Genevieve, but manufacturing isn't like those theoretical cases you studied in school. Real business requires understanding machinery, supply chains and production schedules. You can't learn that from spreadsheets." He'd turned to my mother then, asking about her garden club's upcoming charity auction, effectively ending the conversation. I'd spent the rest of that dinner picking at my food while they discussed the social calendar, the new country club renovations, and my mother's volunteer work with the Children's Hospital. My carefully researched business plan sat on the table like an unwelcome guest that everyone was too polite to ask to leave. Later that evening, I'd gathered up my materials and driven back to my apartment in downtown Portland, where I'd filed the analysis away and never mentioned it again. 6 months later, Corvell Manufacturing announced its first major expansion into Arizona and New Mexico, following almost exactly the strategy I'd outlined. The business press praised my father's visionary leadership and bold strategic thinking. The expansion proved wildly successful, generating the revenue growth I'd predicted and positioning the company for the market dominance it enjoyed today. But my name never appeared in any of the coverage, and my father never acknowledged that his breakthrough strategy had originated from his daughter's research. That pattern had repeated itself countless times over the years. When I suggested at a family gathering that the company should diversify into green technology manufacturing, I was told that environmental trends were fads that serious businesses couldn't afford to chase. 2 years later, Corvell Manufacturing launched its Sustainable Products division, which now represented 30% of the company's revenue. When I mentioned during a Christmas dinner that automation could streamline their production processes, I was dismissed as someone who doesn't understand the value of skilled labor. The following year, the company invested $50 million in robotic assembly systems that increased productivity by 40%. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Each time, my ideas were filed away as impractical suggestions from someone who doesn't understand the real world of manufacturing. Each time, those same ideas reappeared months later as company initiatives, presented as my father's innovations to impressed boards of directors and admiring business journalists. Each time, I learned to keep my insights to myself, rather than watch them be appropriated and rebranded without acknowledgement. The conditioning had started early. In high school, when I'd won the state championship in business plan competitions, my father had attended the ceremony but spent most of the reception networking with other attendees rather than celebrating with me. When I'd been accepted to Wharton with a partial merit scholarship, the family celebration had focused more on the cost savings than the academic achievement. When I'd graduated summa cum laude and been recruited by 3 different consulting firms, the dinner conversation had centered on why I was choosing to work for other people's companies instead of joining the family business. But joining the family business had never been presented as a real option. When I'd asked about entry-level positions at Corvell Manufacturing during my senior year of college, I'd been told that the company needed to maintain professional standards and avoid nepotism. When I'd suggested starting in the marketing department after completing my MBA, I'd been informed that family members working for the company created uncomfortable dynamics for other employees. The message had been clear: I could orbit around the family business, offering suggestions and insights from the outside, but I couldn't actually participate in its operations or decision-making. So I'd built my own career, piece by piece, client by client, reputation by reputation. I'd started with small consulting projects for local businesses, helping them optimize their operations and develop growth strategies. Word spread, referrals multiplied, and within a few years I was working with companies across the West Coast, specializing in manufacturing and industrial operations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become an expert in exactly the field my father claimed I couldn't understand from spreadsheets. My client list had grown to include some of the most respected names in manufacturing, companies that competed directly with Corvell Manufacturing in several markets. I'd help them streamline their operations, identify acquisition opportunities, and develop the kind of strategic initiatives that my father's business press coverage attributed to his innovative thinking. But my family never asked about my work in any detail, content to categorize it as consulting, and move on to more interesting topics. The dismissal had become so ingrained that even my successes were reframed as something less significant. When I'd been featured in Portland Business Journal's 40 Under 40 Inches list 3 years ago, my mother had mentioned it to her friends as a nice honor for young professionals starting their careers. When my consulting firm had been acquired by a national company for a sum that made headlines in the business press, the family dinner conversation had focused on whether I'd be able to maintain my work-life balance in a larger organization. I'd learned to measure my achievements by external recognition, rather than family acknowledgement. Industry conferences invited me to speak about operational efficiency and strategic planning. Trade publications quoted my insights on market trends and competitive positioning. Clients hired me specifically because of my track record in transforming underperforming manufacturing operations into industry leaders. But at family gatherings, I remained Genevieve, who does some kind of consulting work. The pattern had become so predictable that I'd stopped trying to break it. When relatives asked about my work, I gave vague answers about helping companies improve their operations. When business conversations arose at family events, I listened without contributing, even when the discussion touched on areas where my expertise could have provided valuable insights. It was easier to be invisible than to constantly justify my credibility or watch my contributions be diminished. The moment arrived during the main course, just as the waitstaff was clearing away the dinner plates and preparing for the evening's formal program. My father had been holding court all evening, moving from table to table like a politician working a campaign event, accepting congratulations and sharing stories about the early days of building his business empire. The room hummed with the comfortable chatter of successful people celebrating one of their own, glasses clinking and laughter punctuating conversations about market conditions and industry trends. I was half listening to my cousin Theron describe some minor operational challenge at his facility when the sound system crackled to life. The master of ceremonies, a smooth-voiced local television personality who specialized in corporate events, stepped up to the podium with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention from rooms full of powerful people. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention please," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the dinner conversation. "We're ready to begin the formal portion of this evening's celebration of Darius Corvell's remarkable career and contributions to our community." The room quieted gradually, conversations trailing off as people turned their chairs toward the front and settled in for what promised to be an evening of speeches, presentations, and well-deserved recognition for my father's 4 decades of business leadership. I found myself shifting slightly in my seat, trying to get a better view around the centerpiece that blocked most of my sightline to the head table. "Before we hear from our distinguished speakers," the MC continued, "Mr. Corvell himself would like to share a few words about this milestone in his career, and his gratitude for all the support he's received over the years." The applause was immediate and sustained, the kind of genuine appreciation that comes from respect rather than obligation. My father rose from his seat at the head table, his movements deliberate and confident despite his 73 years. He'd always been a commanding presence, the kind of man who could quiet a room simply by standing up, and tonight was no exception. Even in retirement, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people's livelihoods. He approached the podium with the measured pace of someone who'd delivered countless speeches over the years, each step reinforcing his status as the evening's central figure. The spotlight followed him, casting him in warm light against the elegant backdrop of the hotel ballroom. This was his moment, his celebration, his opportunity to reflect on a career that had transformed a small family operation into a regional industrial powerhouse. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying the resonant quality that had made him such an effective leader and public speaker. "When I started Corvell Manufacturing 42 years ago, I never imagined it would grow into what we see today. Back then, it was just me, 2 employees, and a determination to build something that would last." He launched into a well-crafted speech about the early struggles, the breakthrough moments, and the strategic decisions that had driven the company's growth. He thanked his employees, his business partners, the community leaders who had supported his expansion efforts, and the family members who had stood by him through the challenges of building a business from the ground up. The speech was polished, personal, and perfectly calibrated for an audience of industry leaders and community figures. But as he continued, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Several of the strategic insights he was attributing to his own vision sounded remarkably familiar: the decision to diversify into sustainable manufacturing, the expansion into Southwest markets, the investment in automation technology. These weren't just similar to ideas I'd proposed over the years, they were nearly identical, down to specific market analysis and implementation strategies. "Success in manufacturing," he continued, "requires the ability to see opportunities that others miss, to identify market trends before they become obvious to competitors. It demands strategic thinking that goes beyond quarterly reports to envision where entire industries are heading 5 or 10 years down the road." The irony was almost overwhelming. He was describing exactly the kind of analytical work I'd been doing professionally for over a decade, the same insights I'd been offering to the family business for years, only to have them dismissed as impractical theories from someone who doesn't understand real manufacturing. Now those same insights were being presented as evidence of his visionary leadership to a room full of people who controlled billions of dollars in investment capital. I found myself gripping my water glass tighter as he moved into a section about mentorship and developing the next generation of business leaders. "Throughout my career," he said, "I've tried to identify and nurture talent, to recognize potential even when it doesn't come in the package you might expect. Some of our most successful initiatives have come from unexpected sources, from people who brought fresh perspectives to old problems." The words felt like they were directed at me, but not in the way I might have hoped. Instead of acknowledgement, they felt like appropriation, a way of claiming credit for insights without actually crediting their source. I glanced around the table to see if anyone else was making the connection, but my relatives were listening with the polite attention of family members at a lengthy speech, more focused on when they could politely check their phones than on analyzing the content. Then came the moment that changed everything. My father paused in his speech, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced timing of an experienced public speaker building toward a key point. "As I look around this room tonight," he said, "I see successful business leaders, innovative thinkers, and people who have built their careers on taking calculated risks and turning vision into reality. These are the people who drive our economy forward, who create jobs and opportunities for others." He paused again, and I felt a chill of anticipation, though I couldn't have explained why. But success, he continued, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, requires more than good intentions or theoretical knowledge. It demands practical experience, proven results, and the ability to execute under pressure. It requires the kind of credibility that comes from actually building something significant, not just talking about it. The room remained attentive, but I sensed a subtle shift in energy, as if people were trying to figure out where this was leading. Which is why, my father said, his voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom, I've always believed that at events like this, we should hear from people who have actually accomplished something meaningful in their careers. People who have earned the right to address a room full of successful business leaders. My heart started beating faster, though I still couldn't pinpoint exactly why I felt such a sense of dread. This is a celebration of achievement, he continued, a recognition of what can be accomplished through dedication, hard work, and proven business acumen. So tonight, I want to hear from people who have actually built something, who have created value and generated results in the real world of business. Then he said it, the words that would replay in my mind for months afterward, because failures don't get speeches at my party. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, the entire room seemed frozen, unsure how to respond to what felt like an unexpectedly harsh comment in what had been a celebratory speech. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others looked around to see if they'd missed some context that would make the remark make sense. But I knew exactly what he meant, and whom he was referring to. Across the room, I could feel eyes turning in my direction, people suddenly remembering that the CEO's daughter was somewhere in the audience and wondering if she'd been the target of that pointed comment. The heat rose in my cheeks as conversations that had been paused for the speech resumed in hushed whispers, people putting together the pieces of family dynamics they'd only glimpsed at previous corporate events. My father continued his speech as if nothing had happened, moving seamlessly back into his prepared remarks about gratitude and future opportunities. But the damage was done. In front of 300 of the most influential business leaders in the Pacific Northwest, he had essentially declared that his own daughter was a failure who hadn't earned the right to be heard in serious business discussions. I sat there for the remainder of his speech, my face burning with humiliation but my expression carefully controlled. I'd learned long ago to manage my reactions in public, to maintain composure even when being dismissed or diminished. But this was different. This wasn't a private family dinner where my ideas were politely ignored. This was a public declaration, in front of people I worked with professionally, that I was someone whose opinions and insights were worthless. What my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent the last 8 months engaged in the most complex and significant business transaction of my career. While they saw me as someone who did consulting work, I'd actually been serving as the lead strategic advisor for a private equity consortium that specialized in acquiring and transforming mid-sized manufacturing companies. The work was confidential, requiring non-disclosure agreements that prevented me from discussing the details even with family, but it had positioned me at the center of some of the most significant industrial acquisitions on the West Coast. 3 months ago, I'd received a call that changed everything. Caius Hayes, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development for Meridian Capital Partners, had contacted me directly about a potential acquisition target that had caught their attention. Meridian was one of the most respected private equity firms in the country, with a portfolio of manufacturing companies that generated over $12 billion in annual revenue. When Caius Hayes called, smart business people listen. Genevieve, he'd said during that initial conversation, we've been watching your work in the manufacturing sector, and we're impressed with your track record in operational transformation. We have a situation that requires someone with your specific expertise and industry knowledge. The situation, as it turned out, was Corvell Manufacturing. Meridian had been quietly analyzing mid-sized manufacturing companies in the Pacific Northwest, looking for acquisition opportunities that aligned with their strategy of consolidating regional players into larger, more efficient operations. Corvell Manufacturing had appeared on their radar as a particularly attractive target, a well-managed company with strong market position, but limited capital for the kind of expansion that could take it to the next level. We understand there might be some personal complications given your family connection, Caius had continued, but we need someone who truly understands this company's operations, market position, and growth potential. Your reputation in the industry suggests you're exactly the person we need leading this analysis. The irony was almost overwhelming. The same expertise that my family dismissed as theoretical consulting work had made me one of the most sought-after advisors in the industry for exactly this type of strategic analysis. While my father saw me as someone who didn't understand real manufacturing, Meridian Capital Partners was paying me a seven-figure consulting fee to evaluate his company's acquisition potential. Over the following months, I'd conducted the most comprehensive analysis of Corvell Manufacturing that had ever been undertaken. I'd examined every aspect of the company's operations, from supply chain efficiency to market positioning, from competitive advantages to growth constraints. I'd analyzed their financial performance, operational metrics, and strategic positioning with the kind of detailed scrutiny that only came from years of experience in manufacturing sector consulting. What I found was a company that was both stronger and more vulnerable than my father realized. Corvell Manufacturing had built an impressive market position and maintained consistent profitability, but it was also approaching a critical inflection point where it would either need significant capital investment for expansion or risk being overtaken by larger competitors with deeper resources. The company was perfectly positioned for the kind of strategic transformation that Meridian specialized in implementing. But the analysis revealed something else that was even more significant. Corvell Manufacturing's most valuable asset wasn't its facilities or equipment, or even its market position. It was the operational knowledge and strategic insights that had driven its growth over the past decade, many of which could be traced directly back to initiatives that had originated from my supposedly worthless suggestions over family dinners. The Sustainable Manufacturing division, that now represented 30% of the company's revenue, had been built using the exact market analysis I'd presented years ago. The automation investments that had increased productivity by 40% followed the implementation strategy I'd outlined in detail. Even the company's current market positioning reflected strategic recommendations I'd made that had been initially dismissed as impractical. As I dug deeper into the company's internal documents and strategic planning materials, I found traces of my influence throughout the organization's development. Ideas I'd proposed in family conversations had been implemented months or years later, often with minor modifications but following the essential framework I'd originally suggested. My father had been building his visionary leadership reputation on insights that originated from the daughter he publicly dismissed as a failure. But Meridian's interest in Corvell Manufacturing went beyond just acquiring another mid-sized company. They were specifically interested in the expertise that had driven the company's strategic development, the analytical capabilities that had identified market opportunities and operational improvements ahead of competitors. They wanted to acquire not just the company, but the strategic mind behind its most successful initiatives, which is where the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Genevieve, Caius had said during a meeting 6 weeks ago, we've been thinking about this acquisition from a broader perspective. Corvell Manufacturing is an attractive target, but what really interests us is the strategic capability that's driven its success. We want to acquire the company, but we also want to ensure we retain the expertise that's made it successful. I'd assumed he was talking about bringing my father into some kind of advisory role, leveraging his experience and industry knowledge to guide the transition. That would have been the conventional approach, keeping the founding leadership involved to maintain continuity and institutional knowledge. Actually, Caius had continued, we're more interested in your expertise than your father's. Our analysis suggests that the strategic insights driving Corvell's success over the past decade have come from someone with a much more sophisticated understanding of industry trends and competitive positioning than typical manufacturing executives possess. Someone with your background and analytical capabilities. The proposal he outlined was unlike anything I'd expected. Meridian didn't just want to acquire Corvell Manufacturing, they wanted to install new leadership that could accelerate the company's growth and implement the kind of strategic initiatives that would transform it from a regional player into a national presence. They'd analyzed my track record, studied the companies I'd helped transform, and concluded that I was exactly the leader they needed to execute that vision. We'd like you to consider taking on the CEO role, Caius had said. Not as a consultant or advisor, but as the permanent executive leadership of the company. We believe you have the expertise and vision to take Corvell Manufacturing to a completely different level. The offer was staggering, both financially and professionally. Meridian was prepared to acquire Corvell Manufacturing for substantially above market value, implement a comprehensive expansion strategy that would triple the company's size within 5 years, and install me as the CEO with full operational authority and a compensation package that reflected the scope of the transformation they envisioned. But there was one condition that made the opportunity even more complex. My father's retirement needed to be positioned as a natural transition, rather than a forced change, which meant the timing had to be coordinated with his existing plans to step down. Meridian didn't want the acquisition to appear hostile or disruptive. They wanted it to look like a logical evolution that built on the company's existing success while positioning it for accelerated growth. Which meant that tonight's retirement celebration wasn't just a farewell party for my father's career. It was also the last public event before Meridian announced their acquisition and my appointment as CEO. The contracts had been signed, the financing arranged, and the transition plan finalized. In less than a week, the business press would be reporting that Corvell Manufacturing had been acquired by Meridian Capital Partners, and that Genevieve Finch had been named as the new CEO, tasked with leading the company's national expansion. The woman sitting in the back of the ballroom, dismissed as a failure who didn't deserve to give speeches, was actually the incoming leader of the company being celebrated. The daughter whose ideas had been appropriated and rebranded as visionary leadership was about to become the official architect of the company's future. The family member who'd been excluded from meaningful participation in the business was now positioned to direct its transformation into something far larger and more significant than my father had ever imagined. I was still processing the sting of my father's public dismissal when I noticed a subtle shift in the energy near the ballroom's main entrance. 3 figures in dark business attire had entered during the applause following my father's speech, moving with the kind of purposeful discretion that suggested their arrival was both expected and significant. Even from across the room, I recognized the lead figure immediately, Caius Hayes, whose presence here could only mean one thing. Caius moved through the crowd, with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention without demanding. At 58, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd spent 3 decades making decisions that affected billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, and when he paused to shake hands with the mayor, their conversation carried the weight of 2 people who understood the significance of whatever was about to unfold. Accompanying him were 2 other Meridian executives I'd worked with extensively over the past 8 months. Sylvan Orestal, the firm's chief legal counsel, whose presence indicated that whatever announcement was coming would have immediate legal and regulatory implications. And Mariel Draven, senior director of communications, whose job was managing the public narrative around major acquisitions and leadership transitions. This wasn't a casual appearance at a retirement party. This was a coordinated corporate event. I watched them navigate the room with practiced ease, engaging in brief conversations with key figures while clearly moving toward a specific objective. They spoke with the bank president who'd been financing Corvell Manufacturing's recent expansion, the mayor who'd been courting manufacturing companies to relocate to Portland, and several board members from related companies who would need to understand how this transition affected their own business relationships. My father, still basking in the glow of appreciation following his speech, seemed initially pleased to see such distinguished visitors at his retirement celebration. I watched him approach Caius with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any business gathering, extending his hand in welcome and preparing to graciously accept whatever additional recognition these corporate leaders had come to bestow. But something in Caius's demeanor suggested this wasn't a social visit. His handshake was professional rather than congratulatory, his expression serious rather than celebratory. Even from across the room, I could see my father's posture shift slightly as their brief conversation progressed, his confident smile giving way to something more guarded and uncertain. The master of ceremonies had been preparing to introduce the evening's next speaker when Caius approached the podium area, engaging in a quiet discussion that clearly altered the program's planned sequence. I watched the MC nod repeatedly, checking notes and adjusting his prepared remarks based on whatever Caius was explaining. The smooth flow of the evening's celebration was being redirected by forces that most of the guests couldn't yet identify. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, his voice carrying a subtle tension that suggested the evening was taking an unexpected turn. "We have some distinguished guests who'd like to share a few words before we continue with our planned program. Please welcome Caius Hayes, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development for Meridian Capital Partners." The reaction was immediate and telling. Business leaders throughout the room straightened in their chairs, conversations ceased, and attention focused with laser intensity on the podium. Meridian Capital Partners wasn't just another investment firm, they were the kind of organization that transformed entire industries through strategic acquisitions and operational improvements. When Meridian made announcements at corporate events, smart people listened carefully because fortunes and careers often hung in the balance. Caius approached the microphone with the measured pace of someone delivering news that would reshape everyone's understanding of the evening's significance. He surveyed the room with the calculating gaze of an executive who'd spent decades evaluating companies, markets, and opportunities. His presence alone enough to shift the entire energy of the celebration. "Thank you for allowing me to interrupt this well-deserved celebration of Darius Corvell's remarkable career," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing rooms full of powerful people. "Meridian Capital Partners has had the privilege of working with Corvell Manufacturing over the past several months, analyzing opportunities for strategic growth and market expansion." The room had gone completely silent. I could feel the tension building as 300 successful business people tried to process what this unexpected announcement might mean for their own interests and relationships. Corporate acquisitions at retirement parties weren't unprecedented, but they were certainly dramatic enough to command absolute attention. "Corvell Manufacturing," Caius continued, "represents exactly the kind of strategic opportunity that Meridian seeks: a well-managed company with strong market position, exceptional operational efficiency, and tremendous potential for accelerated growth under the right leadership structure." My father's face had gone pale, his confident celebration demeanor replaced by something approaching panic as he realized this wasn't additional recognition, but rather a fundamental change in his company's ownership and control. I could see him scanning the room, trying to understand how this development had occurred without his knowledge or involvement. "Effective immediately," Caius announced, "Meridian Capital Partners has completed the acquisition of Corvell Manufacturing, with plans for comprehensive expansion that will transform the company from a regional leader into a national manufacturing presence." The implications hit the room like a shockwave. Guests began whispering urgently to each other, trying to process what this meant for existing business relationships, ongoing contracts, and future opportunities. The mayor looked confused, having apparently been courting a company that was no longer locally owned. Bank executives appeared concerned about existing loan agreements and credit relationships. Board members from partner companies were clearly calculating how this change would affect their own operations. But Caius wasn't finished. "This acquisition represents more than just a change in ownership," he continued. "It reflects Meridian's commitment to identifying and supporting the kind of strategic leadership that can drive exceptional growth in competitive markets. Which brings me to the primary reason for our presence here tonight." He paused, allowing the tension to build while scanning the room with the practiced timing of someone who understood the dramatic impact of what he was about to reveal. Successful corporate transformations require leadership that combines deep industry knowledge with proven strategic capabilities, operational expertise with innovative thinking, and established credibility with the vision to identify opportunities that others might miss. I felt my pulse quicken, knowing that this moment had been planned for months but still feeling unprepared for the reality of watching it unfold in front of 300 people who had just witnessed my father dismiss me as a failure. After extensive evaluation of potential candidates, Caius continued, "Meridian has selected new executive leadership for Corvell Manufacturing, someone whose track record in strategic consulting and operational transformation makes them uniquely qualified to guide the company's national expansion." The silence in the room was absolute now, every person focused completely on understanding who would be taking control of a company that employed thousands of people and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. "It gives me great pleasure," Caius said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with unmistakable authority, "to introduce the incoming Chief Executive Officer of Corvell Manufacturing, effective next Monday morning." The pause felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. "Miss Genevieve Finch." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap that hadn't quite finished echoing. "Miss Genevieve Finch." 300 faces turned in unison toward the back of the ballroom, scanning the crowd with the desperate intensity of people trying to locate someone they'd never bothered to notice before. I felt the weight of their collective attention like a physical force, 300 pairs of eyes searching for the woman who had just been named CEO of a company worth nearly $500 million. For a moment that felt like an eternity, nobody moved. The silence was so complete that I could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic outside the hotel. Then slowly, deliberately, I stood up from my chair at table 12, the same table where I'd been relegated to sit with the distant relatives and minor employees, the table that had blocked my view of the head table where all the important conversations had been taking place. The reaction was immediate and visceral. I heard someone gasp audibly, followed by a wave of whispered conversations that rippled through the crowd like water flowing around a stone. "That's her, the daughter. I had no idea. She was sitting right there the whole time." The fragments of conversation created a backdrop of confusion and amazement as people tried to reconcile the woman they'd dismissed or ignored with the business leader who had just been introduced as their new CEO. My father's face had gone completely white. He stood frozen near the head table, his mouth slightly open as if he'd been preparing to speak, but had forgotten what he intended to say. His eyes met mine across the crowded ballroom, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his expression that I'd never witnessed before, complete and utter shock mixed with what appeared to be dawning comprehension of how fundamentally he'd misunderstood the situation. My mother's reaction was equally telling. Camille Sterling, who had spent decades perfecting the art of gracious social navigation, looked genuinely bewildered. Her carefully maintained composure cracked slightly as she glanced between me and my father, clearly trying to process how the daughter she'd introduced to people as someone who did consulting work had suddenly become the center of the most significant business announcement of the evening. But it was the reaction of the business leaders throughout the room that truly drove home the magnitude of what was happening. These were people who prided themselves on understanding market dynamics, recognizing talent, and identifying the key players in their industry. Yet they had spent the entire evening overlooking someone who was about to become one of the most powerful executives in Pacific Northwest manufacturing. The mayor of Portland, who had been courting Corvell Manufacturing for additional municipal investment, looked particularly stunned. He'd spent 20 minutes earlier in the evening discussing economic development strategies with my father, apparently unaware that the real decision-maker for the company's future expansion was sitting unnoticed at a back table. His aide was already whispering urgently in his ear, probably explaining that they'd need to completely recalibrate their approach to maintaining the company's local presence. The bank president who'd been financing Corvell's recent growth appeared equally disoriented. Banking relationships in manufacturing were built on personal connections and long-term trust, and he'd clearly assumed that those relationships would continue with whoever succeeded my father. Now he was staring at someone he'd never had a substantive business conversation with, realizing that his institution's most significant manufacturing client would soon be led by a woman he'd probably passed in the hallway without a second glance. 3 different board members from partner companies were having animated conversations with their spouses, clearly trying to understand what this leadership change meant for existing contracts and collaborative projects. These were strategic relationships that had been built over years of working directly with my father, and they were suddenly faced with the prospect of renegotiating everything with someone they knew nothing about professionally. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the group of younger executives who had been clustered near the bar throughout the evening. These were rising leaders in the Portland business community, people in their 30s and 40s who represented the next generation of industrial leadership. Several of them were now staring at me with expressions of recognition and what appeared to be professional respect. "Wait," I heard one of them say to his companion, "isn't that the woman who spoke at the Manufacturing Innovation Conference last year? The one who presented that analysis on supply chain optimization that everyone's been talking about?" His companion nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, and she was on that panel about automation strategies at the Oregon Business Summit. I remember thinking her insights were incredibly sophisticated. The recognition was spreading through the room like a wave, people suddenly connecting the anonymous woman at table 12 with the industry expert whose work they'd been following without realizing her identity. Trade publication interviews where I'd been quoted as senior manufacturing consultant Genevieve Finch, conference presentations where I'd been introduced simply as an independent strategic advisor, consulting projects where I'd worked with their companies under non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing my involvement publicly. All of those professional interactions had created a scattered impression of someone with significant expertise in manufacturing strategy, but none of these business leaders had connected that expertise with Darius Corvell's daughter who did some kind of consulting work. The compartmentalization had been so complete that they'd been tracking my professional reputation for years without realizing they were dismissing that same person at family-oriented corporate events. Caius Hayes watched this recognition unfold with the satisfied expression of someone who had orchestrated exactly the dramatic revelation he'd intended. He'd timed this announcement perfectly, allowing my father's dismissive comment about failures to hang in the air before demonstrating just how catastrophically wrong that assessment had been. The contrast between my father's public humiliation of me and my subsequent introduction as CEO was so stark that it created exactly the kind of memorable moment that would define how this transition was perceived throughout the industry. Miss Finch, Caius continued, his voice cutting through the buzzing conversations, has spent the past 8 months serving as lead strategic advisor for Meridian's evaluation of Corval Manufacturing. Her analysis and recommendations had been instrumental in developing the acquisition strategy and expansion plans that will guide the company's transformation into a national presence. The implications of this statement sent another shockwave through the room. People were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a surprising choice for CEO, this was someone who had been intimately involved in analyzing and planning the company's future for months while appearing to be completely disconnected from its operations. The level of strategic thinking and market analysis required for that kind of advisory role was far beyond what anyone in the room had attributed to the quiet woman at table 12. My cousin Theron looked completely bewildered, turning to his wife Leora with an expression that suggested he was questioning everything he thought he knew about family dynamics. They'd spent the entire dinner making polite conversation about my little projects while sitting next to someone who had been orchestrating the acquisition of the family business. The irony was so complete that it bordered on surreal. Several of the investors and business development professionals in the crowd were clearly running rapid calculations in their heads, trying to understand what this meant for their own interests and opportunities. A Meridian Capital Partners acquisition with new leadership typically signaled aggressive expansion plans, which could mean everything from new partnership opportunities to competitive threats for their own companies. The business journalists who had attended to cover my father's retirement were frantically taking notes and making phone calls, realizing that they'd stumbled into a much bigger story than a routine corporate transition. This was the kind of dramatic leadership reversal that would make headlines not just in the local business press but potentially in national publications that covered significant industrial acquisitions. I began walking toward the front of the room, my heels clicking on the polished floor with a rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed ballroom. Every step carried me further from the marginal position I'd occupied for 35 years and closer to a level of authority and recognition that I'd been building toward throughout my entire career, even when my own family couldn't see it. As I approached the podium, I passed my father, who remained frozen in apparent shock near the head table. For a brief moment our eyes met again, and I saw something in his expression that looked almost like fear. Not fear of me personally, but fear of how fundamentally he'd misunderstood the situation and what that meant for his legacy and reputation. The man who had just publicly declared that failures don't get speeches was watching his supposed failure take control of everything he'd built. Caius stepped aside as I reached the microphone, but not before placing a supportive hand on my shoulder in a gesture that communicated both professional respect and personal confidence in my capabilities. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The senior vice president of one of the country's most prestigious private equity firms was publicly demonstrating his faith in my leadership. I looked out over the sea of faces, many of which were still showing expressions of confusion, surprise, and rapid recalculation. These were people who had dismissed me, ignored me, or simply never bothered to learn anything substantive about my professional capabilities. Now they were hanging on my every word, waiting to understand what my leadership would mean for their own business interests and relationships. "Thank you, Caius," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system and reaching every corner of the ballroom. "And thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my father's remarkable career and contributions to our industry." I paused deliberately, allowing the contrast between my gracious acknowledgement and my father's earlier dismissal to register with the audience. Leadership, I'd learned, often revealed itself in how people responded to being underestimated or attacked. My father had chosen to use his platform to humiliate me publicly. I was choosing to use mine to demonstrate the kind of professional dignity that actually commanded respect. "For those of you who don't know me professionally," I continued, "my name is Genevieve Finch, and I've spent the past 15 years working as a strategic consultant specializing in manufacturing operations and industrial development. Over that time, I've had the privilege of working with companies throughout the West Coast, helping them optimize their operations, identify growth opportunities, and develop the kind of strategic initiatives that drive sustainable competitive advantage. I could see people throughout the room nodding with recognition as I spoke, connecting my introduction with presentations they'd seen, articles they'd read, or consulting projects their own companies had undertaken. The professional context was helping them understand that this wasn't a case of nepotism or unexpected promotion, but rather the recognition of expertise they'd been exposed to without realizing its source. My work has included comprehensive analysis of supply chain optimization, automation implementation strategies, sustainable manufacturing transitions, and market expansion planning, I continued. I've been particularly focused on helping established manufacturing companies identify and execute the kind of transformational growth that takes them from regional players to national market leaders. This was the kind of specific professional language that resonated with the business leaders in the audience, demonstrating that I understood the complexities and challenges they dealt with in their own operations. I wasn't speaking in generalities or theoretical concepts, I was describing exactly the kinds of strategic challenges that kept manufacturing executives awake at night. Which brings me to Corvell Manufacturing, I said, allowing a slight smile to cross my face as I prepared to reveal the full scope of what had been happening behind the scenes. Over the past 8 months, I've had the opportunity to conduct the most comprehensive strategic analysis of this company that has ever been undertaken, examining every aspect of its operations, market position, competitive advantages, and growth potential. The room was completely silent now, everyone focused on understanding what this analysis had revealed and what it meant for the company's future direction. What I found was a company with extraordinary potential that has been constrained primarily by access to the kind of capital and strategic resources necessary for national expansion, I continued. Corvell Manufacturing has built an impressive market position and maintained consistent profitability, but it's also approaching an inflection point where it will either accelerate its growth trajectory or risk being overtaken by larger competitors with deeper resources. This was strategic analysis at a level that impressed the business professionals in the audience, demonstrating that I understood not just the company's current situation but also the competitive dynamics that would shape its future prospects. I was speaking their language, addressing their concerns, and demonstrating the kind of sophisticated thinking that justified Meridian's confidence in my leadership capabilities. The opportunity that Meridian Capital Partners has identified, I said, is to provide Corvell Manufacturing with the resources, strategic support, and operational expertise necessary to transform it from a regional leader into a national manufacturing presence. This isn't just about acquiring an existing company, it's about unleashing the potential that has been constrained by limited access to growth capital. I could see the business implications registering throughout the room. This wasn't a defensive acquisition or a consolidation play, this was an aggressive growth strategy that would create new opportunities, generate additional jobs, and potentially transform the competitive landscape in several manufacturing sectors. Under Meridian's ownership and with new leadership focused specifically on strategic expansion, I concluded, Corvell Manufacturing will be implementing a comprehensive growth plan that includes facility expansion, technology upgrades, market diversification, and strategic acquisitions that will position the company as a dominant force in North American manufacturing. The applause that followed was different from the polite recognition my father had received earlier. This was the kind of sustained enthusiastic response that business leaders reserved for announcements that promised significant opportunities for collaboration, partnership, and mutual benefit. I wasn't just being acknowledged as the new CEO, I was being recognized as someone whose leadership would create value for everyone in the room, whose businesses intersected with manufacturing. But as the applause continued, I found myself looking directly at my father, who remained standing near the head table with an expression that combined shock, confusion, and what appeared to be dawning realization of how completely he'd misunderstood both the situation and his daughter's capabilities. The man who had spent 42 years building Corvell Manufacturing into a regional powerhouse was watching someone he'd dismissed as a failure take control of that legacy and transform it into something far larger and more significant than he'd ever imagined possible. And the woman he'd just told 300 influential business leaders was unworthy of giving speeches had just delivered the most important presentation of the evening, outlining a vision for growth and transformation that would reshape the industry he'd spent his entire career trying to master. The reversal was so complete, so dramatic, and so publicly witnessed that it would become the kind of story people told for years afterward as an example of how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone whose true capabilities you'd never bothered to understand. But for me, standing at that podium with 300 business leaders applauding my vision for the company's future, it felt less like revenge, and more like finally being able to speak in my own voice about work I'd been doing expertly for years. The silence was finally broken, not by dismissal or appropriation, but by recognition of expertise that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. The applause had barely died down when the real drama began. As I stepped away from the podium, the ballroom erupted into a chaos of movement and urgent conversations that felt more like the trading floor of a stock exchange than the elegant retirement celebration it had been just moments before. 300 business leaders were simultaneously trying to process what they'd witnessed, recalculate their professional relationships, and position themselves advantageously in a landscape that had just been completely transformed. My father remained frozen near the head table, his face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and what appeared to be dawning horror as the full implications of the situation became clear to him. The man who had just publicly dismissed his daughter as a failure was now watching that same daughter command the attention and respect of every significant business leader in the Pacific Northwest. The cognitive dissonance was so complete that he seemed unable to move or speak, just standing there as conversations swirled around him about the dramatic leadership transition he'd apparently known nothing about. The business journalists who had attended expecting to write routine coverage of a corporate retirement were now frantically making phone calls and taking notes, realizing they'd witnessed one of the most dramatic corporate reversals in recent Pacific Northwest business history. I could hear fragments of their conversations as they tried to explain the story to editors and colleagues who hadn't been present for the stunning revelation. "No, you don't understand," one reporter was saying into his phone, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd stumbled onto a major scoop. "The daughter he just publicly humiliated is the new CEO. She's been planning the acquisition for months while sitting at the family reject table. This isn't just a corporate transition, this is a complete reversal of everything everyone thought they knew about this family's business dynamics." Another journalist was already live tweeting the developments, her fingers flying across her phone screen as she tried to capture the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Breaking: Darius Corvell's failures, daughter revealed as incoming CEO of acquired Corvell Manufacturing. 8 months of secret negotiations culminate in stunning reversal at retirement gala. / corporate drama / manufacturing news. The immediate business implications were causing a frenzy of activity throughout the room. The mayor's aide was urgently briefing him on what this meant for the city's economic development strategy, explaining that they'd need to completely restructure their approach to maintaining Corvell Manufacturing's local presence. The bank executives were huddling together, clearly concerned about existing loan agreements and credit relationships that would now be managed by someone they'd never had substantive business discussions with. But perhaps most telling was the reaction of the business leaders who had been dismissing or ignoring me throughout the evening. The transformation in their behavior was immediate and dramatic, like watching a tide change in real time. People who had looked through me as if I were invisible were now approaching with expressions of professional respect and barely concealed desperation to establish meaningful contact with someone who had suddenly become one of the most powerful executives in the region. The president of the Oregon Manufacturers Association, who had delivered remarks earlier about my father's contributions to the industry, was one of the first to approach me as I descended from the podium area. His demeanor had shifted completely from the polite but distant acknowledgement he'd offered when we'd been briefly introduced earlier in the evening. "Miss Finch," he said, extending his hand with the kind of focused attention that successful business leaders reserved for people who could significantly impact their organizations. "I have to admit, I had no idea about the scope of your involvement in manufacturing strategy. I'd love to schedule a meeting to discuss how Corvell's expansion plans might align with our association's regional development initiatives." Before I could respond, the bank president who had been financing Corvell's recent growth was positioning himself for his own introduction. His approach carried the urgency of someone who'd realized that his institution's most significant manufacturing relationship was about to be managed by someone he knew nothing about professionally. "Genevieve," he said, using my first name with the presumptuous familiarity that banking executives often employed when trying to establish instant rapport with important clients. "Tom Richardson from Pacific Northwest Capital. I've been handling Corvell's financing for the past 8 years, and I'd very much like to discuss how we can support Meridian's expansion plans." The irony was overwhelming. These were people who had spent the entire evening treating me as an irrelevant family member whose presence was barely worth acknowledging. Now they were competing for my attention like courtiers trying to gain access to a newly crowned monarch. The transformation in their behavior was so complete and so transparently opportunistic that it would have been amusing if it weren't so revealing about the superficial nature of business relationships based purely on perceived power and status. More concerning was watching my family members try to process what had just happened. My mother, Camille Sterling, who had spent decades perfecting the art of gracious social navigation, looked genuinely lost. She kept glancing between me and my father, clearly trying to understand how the daughter she'd been introducing to people as someone who did consulting work had suddenly become the center of the most significant business announcement of the evening. My cousin Theron approached me with an expression that mixed confusion with what appeared to be a desperate attempt to recalibrate our family relationship. His wife Leora followed closely behind, her earlier condescending comments about my little projects now hanging in the air like a monument to poor judgment. "Genevieve," Theron said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd realized he'd fundamentally misunderstood a situation and was trying to recover without making things worse. "I had no idea about your involvement with Meridian. This is incredible news for the company and the family." The sudden shift in his attitude was so transparent that it was almost painful to witness. This was the same cousin who had spent dinner making polite but dismissive conversation about my career, clearly categorizing me as the family member who hadn't achieved anything significant. Now he was trying to position himself as supportive and admiring, apparently hoping to benefit from a relationship with someone whose authority he'd never bothered to recognize. Leora's attempted recovery was even more awkward. "I always knew you were working on something important," she said, her voice carrying the kind of false enthusiasm that people used when trying to rewrite history in real time. "When I mentioned your projects earlier, I was really referring to your strategic consulting work. I've always been so impressed by your expertise." The revisionist history was so blatant that it bordered on insulting, but I responded with the kind of professional grace that I'd learned was more effective than calling out obvious falsehoods. "Thank you, Leora. I appreciate your support." But the most difficult interaction came when my father finally approached me, moving with the uncertain gait of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally shattered. His face had regained some color, but his expression remained a mixture of confusion, embarrassment, and what appeared to be genuine bewilderment about how the situation had developed without his knowledge or involvement. "Genevieve," he said, his voice carrying none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier speech. "I need to understand how this happened. How long have you been working with Meridian? Why wasn't I informed about the acquisition discussions?" The questions revealed just how completely he'd been excluded from the strategic planning that would determine his company's future. The man who had built Corvell Manufacturing from a small operation into a regional powerhouse had been sidelined in the most important business transaction in the company's history. Largely because his dismissive attitude toward his daughter had prevented him from recognizing her growing influence in the industry. "The acquisition discussions have been ongoing for 8 months, I replied, keeping my voice professional and measured despite the emotional complexity of the moment. Meridian's initial interest in Corvell Manufacturing came through my consulting work with other companies in their portfolio. They asked me to lead the strategic analysis because of my experience in manufacturing sector evaluations." I could see him trying to process this information, his business mind working to understand how major corporate decisions had been made around his company without his participation or even his awareness. The cognitive dissonance was clearly overwhelming for someone who had spent 4 decades making every significant strategic decision for Corvell Manufacturing. "But why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of what sounded almost like hurt beneath the confusion. "Why didn't you mention that you were working on something this significant?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of family dynamics and missed opportunities for genuine communication. I looked at him directly, remembering every business idea I'd shared that had been dismissed as impractical, every strategic insight that had been appropriated without acknowledgement, every professional achievement that had been minimized or ignored. When would have been the right time to mention it? I asked quietly. During the family dinners where my business suggestions were dismissed as theoretical, during the holiday gatherings where my career was described as some kind of consulting work. Or perhaps earlier this evening, when you announced that failures don't get speeches at your party. The impact of my words was immediate and visible. My father's face flushed as he realized that his pattern of dismissal had created exactly the situation he was now struggling to understand. He'd spent years making it clear that my insights and expertise weren't valued or wanted, so I'd stopped offering them to the family and had instead built my professional reputation with clients who recognized and compensated my capabilities appropriately. The conversation was interrupted by Caius Hayes, who approached our family group with Silwyn Aristal and Mariel Draven, clearly intending to manage the immediate aftermath of the announcement and ensure that the transition proceeded smoothly. His presence provided a welcome break from the emotional intensity of trying to explain years of family dysfunction to a man who was just beginning to understand how his behavior had shaped the situation. "Darius," Caius said, extending his hand to my father with the professional courtesy that private equity executives used when managing complex transitions. "I want to thank you for building such an impressive company. Meridian's investment in Corvell Manufacturing reflects our confidence in the foundation you've established and the growth potential that Genevieve's leadership will unlock." My father shook hands mechanically, still clearly processing the reality that his company had been acquired by people who valued his daughter's strategic capabilities more highly than his own continued leadership. The diplomatic language couldn't disguise the fundamental message: he was being replaced by someone whose expertise Meridian considered more valuable for the company's future development. "The transition timeline will allow for appropriate knowledge transfer and continuity planning," Silwyn added, her legal training evident in the precision of her language. "We want to ensure that Corvell's existing relationships and operational excellence are maintained while implementing the strategic initiatives that will drive accelerated growth." The business terminology was carefully chosen to make the leadership change sound like a natural evolution rather than a dramatic replacement, but everyone involved understood the reality. My father was being gracefully but definitively sidelined by people who had concluded that his daughter possessed superior strategic vision and operational expertise. Meanwhile, the broader business community in the ballroom was engaged in their own complex recalculations of relationships and opportunities. I could observe conversations throughout the room where people were reassessing everything they thought they knew about Corvell Manufacturing's future prospects and strategic direction. The acquisition by Meridian Capital Partners suggested aggressive expansion plans that could create new partnership opportunities, competitive threats, or market disruptions depending on each person's own business interests. The mayor had cornered one of his economic development advisors near the bar, clearly receiving a rapid briefing on what this meant for Portland's manufacturing sector and how the city should position itself to benefit from Corvell's planned expansion. The bank executives were having their own urgent discussion about existing credit relationships and the implications of working with new leadership backed by Meridian's substantial financial resources. Several of the partner company executives were taking advantage of the networking opportunity to introduce themselves and begin exploring how the leadership transition might affect existing collaborative relationships. Their approach was uniformly respectful and professional, a stark contrast to the dismissive or indifferent treatment I'd received from many of the same people earlier in the evening. But perhaps most satisfying was observing the business journalists as they worked to understand and report on the story that was unfolding. This wasn't just a routine corporate transition, this was a dramatic reversal that highlighted fundamental questions about how business talent was recognized, developed, and utilized. The story had elements that would resonate far beyond the Pacific Northwest manufacturing sector: family dynamics, gender bias, strategic vision, and the dangers of underestimating people whose capabilities you'd never bothered to understand. One reporter approached me as the initial conversations with family members and Meridian executives concluded, clearly hoping to get some insight into the personal dynamics that had created such a dramatic situation. "Finch," she said, her digital recorder already running, "this has to be one of the most unusual corporate announcements I've ever witnessed. Can you comment on how it felt to be introduced as CEO just minutes after your father's remarks about failures not deserving speeches?" The question was direct and potentially inflammatory, clearly designed to elicit some kind of emotional response that would make good copy. But I'd spent 15 years learning to navigate complex business relationships and media interactions, and I understood that my response would help define how this transition was perceived throughout the industry. "Leadership transitions are always complex," I replied, choosing my words carefully to maintain professionalism while acknowledging the dramatic nature of what had occurred. Meridian Capital Partners made their decision based on strategic analysis and growth potential. I'm focused on implementing the expansion plans that will benefit Corvell's employees, customers, and the broader Pacific Northwest manufacturing community. The response was diplomatically perfect, avoiding personal drama while positioning myself as a serious business leader focused on operational excellence rather than family dynamics. But the reporter wasn't satisfied with corporate speak. "But surely you must have some personal reaction to the timing and circumstances of this announcement," she pressed. "Your father's comments were quite pointed, and then to have you revealed as the new CEO must have been emotionally significant." I paused for a moment, considering how to respond in a way that was honest without being inflammatory, personal without being unprofessional. "I've spent my career building expertise in manufacturing strategy and operational transformation," I said finally. "Tonight's announcement represents recognition of that work by one of the most respected private equity firms in the country. I'm grateful for the opportunity to lead Corvell Manufacturing's next phase of growth, and I'm confident that the results will speak for themselves." The answer struck the right balance between acknowledging the personal significance of the moment and maintaining the kind of professional dignity that would be essential for establishing credibility with employees, customers, and industry partners who would be watching how I handled this transition. As the evening continued, I found myself at the center of a completely transformed social dynamic. The same ballroom that had felt isolating and dismissive just hours earlier had become a networking opportunity where every conversation carried the potential for significant business relationships or strategic partnerships. The woman who had been relegated to table 12 was now the most sought-after person in the room, not because of family connections or social status, but because of demonstrated expertise and recognized authority. But even as I navigated these new interactions with professional grace and strategic thinking, I couldn't completely ignore the emotional complexity of watching my family struggle to understand how fundamentally they'd misunderstood my capabilities and achievements. The reversal was so complete, so publicly witnessed, and so dramatically timed that it would reshape our relationships permanently. The silence had finally been broken, not by appropriation or dismissal, but by recognition that commanded respect from people whose opinions actually mattered in the business world where I'd been building my reputation for 15 years. 3 weeks later, I stood in the corner office that had once belonged to my father, watching the early morning light filter through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Willamette River. The mahogany desk that had intimidated me as a child was now covered with strategic planning documents, acquisition proposals, and expansion blueprints that would transform Corvell Manufacturing from a regional player into a national powerhouse. The nameplate had been changed from Darius Corvell, Chief Executive Officer, to Genevieve Finch, Chief Executive Officer, but the real transformation went far deeper than office furnishings and organizational charts. The business press had been covering the story for weeks, each article adding new layers to what was already being called one of the most dramatic corporate reversals in Pacific Northwest business history. Portland Business Journal had run a cover story titled "The CEO They Never Saw Coming: How Genevieve Finch Built Her Authority in Plain Sight." The article detailed not just the dramatic revelation at the retirement party, but the 15-year career that had positioned me as one of the region's most respected manufacturing consultants while my own family dismissed my work as insignificant. Forbes had picked up the story as part of a broader piece about recognizing executive talent in unexpected places, using my situation as a case study in how traditional corporate hierarchies often overlooked qualified leaders who didn't fit conventional profiles. The Harvard Business Review had requested an interview about strategic planning in family-owned businesses and the challenges of succession when actual expertise didn't align with family expectations. But the most meaningful recognition had come from industry publications that understood the technical complexity of what I'd accomplished. Manufacturing Today had featured an in-depth analysis of the strategic vision that had convinced Meridian Capital Partners to acquire Corvell Manufacturing, highlighting the sophisticated market analysis and operational planning that would guide the company's national expansion. The article positioned me not as a surprising choice for CEO, but as exactly the kind of strategic leader that modern manufacturing companies needed to navigate increasingly complex competitive landscapes. The employee response had been equally telling. During my first all-hands meeting as CEO, I'd expected skepticism or resistance from workers who had been loyal to my father for decades. Instead, I found a workforce that was genuinely excited about the growth opportunities that Meridian's investment would create. Many of the senior managers had been quietly frustrated by the company's limited expansion pace, recognizing that Corvell Manufacturing had the potential for much more aggressive growth if it had access to adequate capital and strategic resources. Ms. Finch, the head of operations, had said after that first meeting, "We've been waiting for someone with the vision to take this company to the next level. Your expansion plans are exactly what we've been hoping to see for years. The comment had been particularly meaningful because it came from someone who had worked directly with my father for over 20 years. His support wasn't based on family loyalty or corporate politics, it was professional recognition from someone who understood manufacturing operations and could evaluate leadership capability based on actual strategic thinking and industry expertise. The acquisition had moved forward with the kind of efficiency that characterized Meridian's approach to corporate development. Within 2 weeks of the retirement party announcement, the paperwork had been finalized, the financing arranged, and the transition timeline established. My father had been offered a consulting role that allowed him to maintain some connection to the company while accepting that operational control had shifted to leadership that Meridian considered more capable of driving aggressive growth. His response to the offer had been complicated and revealing. Initially, he'd seemed genuinely confused about why a consulting role was being presented as generous compensation rather than an insult to someone who had built the company from nothing. The cognitive dissonance of being sidelined in favor of the daughter he'd dismissed was clearly difficult for him to process. But gradually he'd begun to understand that this wasn't personal rejection but rather strategic decision-making based on capabilities and vision that he'd never bothered to recognize. "I think I owe you an apology," he'd said during one of our early transition meetings, his voice carrying a mixture of embarrassment and what appeared to be genuine regret. "I never understood what you were accomplishing professionally. I made assumptions based on my own limited perspective, rather than taking the time to learn about your actual work." The apology was meaningful, but it also highlighted how fundamentally he'd misunderstood the situation for years. This wasn't just about failing to recognize my professional achievements, it was about creating family dynamics that had made it impossible for me to share those achievements even when I might have wanted to. The pattern of dismissal had been so consistent that I'd learned to protect my professional reputation by keeping it separate from family interactions. The important thing now is ensuring a smooth transition that benefits the company and its employees, I'd replied, choosing to focus on operational priorities rather than relitigating years of family dysfunction. "Your institutional knowledge about customer relationships and supplier networks will be valuable as we implement the expansion plans." The response had been diplomatically perfect for managing a complex business transition, but privately I was still processing the emotional complexity of watching someone who had spent decades diminishing my capabilities, suddenly trying to position himself as supportive and collaborative. The transformation in his behavior was dramatic and obvious, but it was also clearly motivated by recognition of my new authority rather than genuine understanding of who I'd been all along. My mother's adjustment had been equally complicated but expressed differently. Camille Sterling had spent decades perfecting the social navigation skills that made her an ideal CEO's wife, but she was struggling to understand how to relate to a daughter whose professional status now exceeded anything she'd previously managed. The woman who had introduced me to business associates as someone who did consulting work was now fielding requests for interviews about what it was like to be the mother of one of the region's most prominent manufacturing executives. "I'm so proud of what you've accomplished," she'd said during a lunch meeting where she'd clearly been trying to recalibrate our relationship. "I always knew you were capable of great things, but I never understood the scope of your professional expertise." The statement was well-intentioned, but historically inaccurate in ways that would have been pointless to correct. My mother's pride was genuine, but it was also newly discovered rather than long-held recognition that had been temporarily overlooked. The distinction mattered because it reflected how completely my family had misunderstood my professional development and capabilities. The broader business community's response had been professionally gratifying in ways that family recognition could never be. Within a week of taking over as CEO, I'd received invitations to speak at 3 different industry conferences, requests for strategic consultation from companies throughout the West Coast, and inquiries about potential partnership opportunities from organizations that had been following my consulting work for years without connecting it to my family identity. The Oregon Manufacturers Association had asked me to join their board of directors, recognizing that Corvell Manufacturing's planned expansion would make me one of the most influential manufacturing executives in the region. The invitation represented exactly the kind of industry leadership role that I'd been building toward throughout my career, but it also symbolized how dramatically my professional status had changed in the perception of people who controlled significant business opportunities. "Your strategic vision for manufacturing automation and supply chain optimization has been influencing industry best practices for years," the association president had explained during our conversation about board membership. Having you in a formal leadership role will benefit every manufacturer in the Pacific Northwest. The comment reflected recognition that extended far beyond my new position as CEO of Corvell Manufacturing. These were people who understood that my expertise in manufacturing strategy had been developing for 15 years and had influenced companies throughout the region, even when my family identity had been largely unknown or irrelevant to that professional reputation. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the transition had been watching how it affected my relationships with industry peers who had been following my work without understanding my family connections. The reaction wasn't surprise at my professional capabilities, but rather amazement that someone whose strategic insights they'd been implementing for years had been so thoroughly underestimated by her own family. I've been recommending your operational efficiency frameworks to clients for 3 years, one colleague had told me during a regional manufacturing conference. When I saw the news about the Corvell manufacturing transition, my first thought was that your family had no idea how lucky they were to have access to your expertise. The comment captured something important about how professional relationships differed from family dynamics. In business settings, my capabilities had been recognized, compensated, and respected by people who evaluated performance based on results rather than assumptions. The consulting work that my family had dismissed as little projects had actually been transforming companies and influencing industry standards throughout the West Coast. The media attention had also created opportunities for addressing broader questions about how business talent was recognized and developed, particularly when it didn't emerge through traditional pathways or conform to conventional expectations. Several interviewers had asked about the challenges of building professional authority when family relationships created obstacles rather than advantages. Success in any field requires building credibility based on demonstrated results rather than inherited status, I'd explained during a podcast interview about women in manufacturing leadership. Sometimes the most valuable expertise develops precisely because someone has to prove themselves through performance rather than relying on assumptions about their capabilities. The response had resonated with other business leaders who had built their careers through expertise and results rather than family connections or traditional corporate hierarchies. The story of being underestimated and then dramatically vindicated apparently struck a chord with people who had experienced similar challenges in gaining recognition for their professional capabilities. 6 months into my tenure as CEO, the results were speaking for themselves in ways that validated Meridian's confidence in my leadership and strategic vision. The first phase of expansion had exceeded projections, with new contracts generating revenue growth of 43% over the previous year. The automation investments had increased productivity while creating higher-skilled jobs that attracted exactly the kind of technical talent that positioned Corvell Manufacturing for continued growth. The Sustainable Manufacturing division had secured contracts with 2 major technology companies that were specifically seeking suppliers with advanced environmental capabilities. These relationships represented exactly the kind of strategic partnerships that would drive long-term competitive advantage, validating the market analysis that had convinced Meridian to pursue the acquisition in the first place. Perhaps most importantly, the company's reputation within the industry had been transformed from a well-managed regional player to an innovative leader that other manufacturers studied for best practices in strategic development and operational excellence. Trade publications were featuring Corvell Manufacturing's expansion model as an example of how established companies could leverage private equity partnerships to accelerate growth without losing operational focus. The personal satisfaction of professional vindication was significant, but the broader impact on industry perceptions was even more meaningful. The story had become a case study in recognizing and developing executive talent in unexpected places, highlighting how traditional assumptions about leadership qualifications could obscure genuine expertise and strategic capability. During a recent board meeting, one of Meridian's senior partners had made a comment that captured the essence of what had been accomplished. This acquisition succeeded because we recognized strategic capability where others saw only family dynamics. The lesson for our entire portfolio is that the most valuable expertise often develops in people who've had to prove themselves through performance rather than position. But even as professional recognition reached levels I'd never expected, the personal relationships required ongoing navigation of complicated emotions and recalibrated expectations. My father had gradually accepted his consulting role and was genuinely contributing to the transition process, but the dynamic between us had been permanently altered by the public demonstration of how completely he'd misunderstood my capabilities. I keep thinking about all the times you tried to share business ideas with me, he'd said during a recent dinner conversation. I realize now that I wasn't just dismissing suggestions, I was rejecting expertise that could have transformed the company years earlier. The acknowledgement was meaningful, but it also highlighted how the pattern of dismissal had cost everyone involved. The company could have benefited from my strategic insights much earlier if family dynamics hadn't created barriers to meaningful collaboration. My professional development could have been enhanced by access to operational experience within the family business. The missed opportunities represented years of potential growth and development that had been sacrificed to assumptions and expectations that prevented genuine communication. Looking back on that evening at the Whitmore Hotel, the dramatic reversal seemed almost inevitable given the professional foundation I'd been building for 15 years. The consulting work that my family had categorized as insignificant had actually been preparing me for exactly the kind of strategic leadership that Meridian needed to implement their expansion vision. The expertise that had been dismissed in family settings had been recognized and valued by industry leaders who evaluated performance based on results rather than assumptions. The woman who had been told that failures don't get speeches had delivered the most important presentation of the evening, outlining a strategic vision that would transform a regional manufacturing company into a national presence. The daughter who had been relegated to Table 12 was now leading board meetings and industry conferences, setting strategic direction for thousands of employees and millions of dollars in annual revenue. But perhaps most importantly, the silence that had been imposed by years of dismissal and appropriation had finally been broken by recognition that commanded respect from people whose opinions actually mattered in the business world where I'd been building my reputation all along. The reversal was complete, publicly witnessed, and professionally validated in ways that would influence how business talent was recognized and developed throughout the industry. Sometimes the most dramatic transformations happen not through sudden revelation but through the patient accumulation of expertise that finally found the platform it deserved. And sometimes the person everyone had overlooked was actually the one who had been preparing for leadership all along. 3 years later, I stood at the podium of the National Manufacturing Excellence Awards, holding the trophy for CEO of the Year while looking out at an audience of industry leaders who had watched Corvell Manufacturing's transformation from regional player to national powerhouse. Under Meridian's backing and my leadership, the company now operated in 12 states, employed over 8,000 people, and had become the benchmark for strategic manufacturing expansion. The business schools were teaching case studies about the acquisition and turnaround, using our success as an example of how private equity partnerships could accelerate growth when paired with visionary leadership. My father, now in his 3rd year as a strategic consultant, had become one of the case study's most quoted sources, speaking candidly about the dangers of underestimating family members and the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of its source. The biggest mistake of my career, he'd told a Harvard Business School researcher, was assuming I understood my daughter's capabilities without ever bothering to investigate her actual professional achievements. I spent 40 years building a company, but she had the vision to transform it into something I never could have imagined. My mother had embraced her new role as the CEO's mother with the same social grace she'd once applied to being the CEO's wife, but with a deeper understanding of what actual business achievement looked like. She'd become an advocate for women in manufacturing, speaking at conferences about the importance of recognizing potential in unexpected places. During my acceptance speech that evening, I looked directly at the section where my family sat, no longer at a back table but in the VIP section where their support was finally aligned with genuine understanding of what I'd accomplished. Leadership, I said to the audience, isn't about demanding recognition, it's about building expertise so undeniable that silence becomes impossible to maintain. The applause that followed felt different from that shocking night at the Whitmore Hotel 3 years earlier. This wasn't surprise or dramatic reversal, this was earned respect from people who understood exactly what I'd built and how I'd built it. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not through sudden revelation but through the patient accumulation of excellence that finally finds the platform it always deserved. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is actually the one who's been preparing to lead them all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.